Brandon is a partner in the school law firm of Miller, Tracy, Braun, Funk, and Miller. Brandon frequently presents at local, state, and national conferences on issues of school law. He serves on the executive committee of the Illinois Council of School Attorneys. Welcome, Brandon. And I'm Linda, your webinar facilitator. I'll be behind the scenes making sure that everything runs smoothly, as well as interacting with you in the chat. So let's get started.
Well, good afternoon, friends. Thanks for hanging out with me a while this afternoon. I hope everybody's having great weather. I know may have some storms around here, so let's hope we get through this hour and this conversation about what's going on out there in the world of school law as it relates to EdTech that we need to be thinking about today. And as we go through things, don't be shy about asking questions in the chat, and we will try and answer those. And as we go through each of our segments, I'll pause specifically again to make sure that we've answered any questions on that topic. But my plan and my agenda for today is to walk through really 5 topics that I think are worth spending some time on to be thinking about. We want to think about, as we talk about hybrid and flexible and virtual learning models, some of the legal issues that are present either in our state law here in Illinois or otherwise that we need to be thinking about. We want to talk about some social learning platforms and social emotional issues with EdTech. We got to talk about money. And of course, you're going to hear me talk about cybersecurity and AI and what's going on and what's new from a policy perspective, from the federal level. There's lots of stuff out there to be thinking about. So let's jump right in and start with some of these, issues that come up with hybrid and flexible learning models. I suspect all of your districts are using virtual platforms in lots of ways to try and expand not only what's going on in terms of regular courses or enrichment courses or adding additional electives for students, but also when we're talking about students who are homebound, for students who may not be able to attend school in person, for students who need an alternative education program. We are seeing more and more of those virtual or hybrid approaches. And I think there's some legal issues about that we need to have on our radar as we think about those issues for us. So let's think about some of the things that are embedded specifically in our state law and then what that might mean for us going forward. One of the ways, right, that we see school districts utilizing these other various hybrid or virtual learning models are the use of e-learning days. Many districts, maybe most districts at this point, I don't know that I have the stats on that, but a good chunk of districts in Illinois are electing to use e-learning days in lieu of emergency days in many circumstances, right? And so the school code does allow a board to adopt a policy that allows for e-learning in lieu of emergency days, up to those 5 emergency days that you can build into your calendar. But I think that we want to be recognizing, of course, that plan has to have some very specific provisions to make sure that what students are doing on those days is in fact still learning. I joke with my own first grader, right? When she's had an e-learning day, I'm not sure it was either e or learning, either one. But I think different districts obviously have different models, and we want to make sure that it is still instructionally robust and meeting those students' needs. I want to talk about a case decided recently in Minnesota. And while their state law in terms of what they allow e-learning days for is a little different, I think the underlying legal issue is still important. And really this issue that comes out of this case in Minnetonka, Minnesota is making sure that when we do have an e-learning day, is it appropriate for especially students with disabilities to be able to have their IEP services provided, to have their IEP minutes provided on that. In this particular case, they used what they called an asynchronous e-learning day. So this was not a situation where you had teachers providing any sort of live virtual instruction, but it was all done through an asynchronous platform for that. And this parent of a student with a disability complained saying, hey, my student's not getting the services required by their IEP on those days. And the court here ultimately agreed with the Minnesota State Department of Ed, saying that the practice here violated the IDEA and violated the rights of this IEP student because it did not account for how the student's IEP would be implemented specifically on that asynchronous e-learning day. So I do think it is important, right? I think this case stands out, right? That we need to make sure that we understand that there's, generally speaking, when we look at the case law, even really from COVID forward, that there's not a reduction in the expectations for FAPE and the services being provided on remote or e-learning days. And we want to make sure that our IEP teams are thinking about that our plan for e-learning days accounts for that, and we aren't overlooking that. So I think, the first piece where we see some legal issues popping up are on those e-learning days, and we want to make sure that we're accounting for providing those supports and providing those minutes of service to students with disabilities on those days. The second area where the school code specifically provides for a hybrid or remote or virtual platform is section 10-29 of the school code. And section 10-29 specifically permits school districts to have a virtual or remote educational program separate from e-learning days, right? Where you can allow students to take virtual coursework in that regard, as so long as you have a policy that permits it. The press policy on this is policy 6185. So as your district is looking at rolling that out or using it in different ways, make sure that what you're doing matches your practice, because the statute says you've got to have some criteria for when you would allow a student to participate in a virtual or remote educational program, and that it has to consider the student's attendance, discipline, academic history, among other things. Now, the default language in the press policy, so if you just use the default language and don't modify it, it's very limiting, right? The default language says it's only available for juniors and seniors in high school who have an appropriate attendance record, no discipline record, and a 2.5 grade point average. Those criteria aren't specifically required by the statute. You just have to set criteria. So you can open it up to additional grade levels. You can have different criteria for when a student might be approved to participate in that. So I do think it's important that if you are going to have a remote educational program and you are going to permit students to choose virtual or hybrid options in lieu of traditional in-person school, again, the school code permits it as long as you have a policy and the policy has criteria. What I am discovering is that there are a lot of school districts that just adopted the default policy and didn't modify it, but are actually permitting, hybrid or virtual instruction for students beyond what the policy says, which again, I think would be okay if that's what the policy said. You can have a more expansive policy under the school code. So I think it's really important that we make sure that what our policy says matches what we're doing. And that's the important thing for me. And that's even an option in our Illinois regulations for students with disabilities, right? So within the Illinois special ed regs, section 226-360 also permits considering a remote educational program for students with disabilities. And so that can be an option for the IEP team to consider. Now, of course, we know that it still has to be FAPE. It still has to be appropriate as determined for that individual student. But we do have, the permission in our school code and in the special ed regulations in Illinois that would allow for that type of a program. And then the other way that I see school districts really using, hybrid and virtual programs are for those students homebound. And to be honest, I think this is a very exciting thing. I think historically, the homebound instruction for students who are medically unable to attend school, we've kind of tried to do the bare minimum as school districts, which hasn't, I think, always best, educational outcome for students in terms of that need. But I think that with the expanded availability of virtual programming, online programming, additional courses, students can have a much better academic experience during times that they are medically unable to attend school. And our regulations in Illinois have said for a long time that instruction can be provided by telephone or other technological device. Those regs have existed for decades, right? And they are written in such an antiquated way that they talk about it being by telephone or other technological device, as long as it's still direct instruction, right? A minimum amount of that is still direct instruction. So I think it is great that we have more options here. I think that there are clearly a place that education is moving. We know that's true in higher ed with colleges and universities. It's only natural that is certainly expanding across the country in terms of those additional virtual options for students at K-12. I think we got to keep some of those legal issues in mind, right? That we've talked about as that relates to our provision of those services. So before we kind of go to our next segment here, or our next topic, are there any questions? Anything anybody wants to share in terms of, how you're using virtual or hybrid models for students and some of the issues you're encountering?
Hey, Brandon, it looks like we have no questions in the chat right now, but doesn't mean that we won't in the future. And I highly recommend, while we have Brandon here, to ask those questions, just because he's here and ready to answer them. So I will keep monitoring the chat, but I think for now we're good to keep moving on.
Very good. Well, as Linda said, if you've got a question, we'll come back many times and have a chance to talk it through. The other issue I want to mention here is sort of some of those more social learning platforms and the social mode aspects to that virtual piece. I think this is sort of a sliding into a slightly different focus from that first topic, where we are looking at, when students are using virtual or digital platforms that can create a sense of social isolation. And we want to make sure that we are addressing those concerns, having opportunities to collaborate, interact with teachers, with educators, with other students, that is really, really important. And so having more social learning platforms so there can be more peer-to-peer learning, more discussion, integrating these into our program, I think are really important, so that it is a more realistic approach with real connections that I think is particularly important to keep in mind. I think sort of related to that, we are seeing a significant increase in school districts looking for social emotional learning apps or other programs that help students with mental health and related concerns. And so, I think just here, I've put some questions out there. Maybe these are questions you want to think about and pop into the chat. Are your districts using any of these sort of social emotional learning apps? And what are some of the concerns that come up with it? I mean, I'm a fan of anything that's going to help give some of that social emotional support for students. And so I really think there is an opportunity for this to be a very beneficial thing, where students can have access to support, especially when we have downstate shortages of social workers and counselors in the school setting. Anything that expands opportunities for some of those, I think is really, really a good thing. Obviously, there are concerns about whether it's always appropriate. Are students interacting? If a student expresses, for example, suicidal ideation to the app, is somebody monitoring that? I do think that there, again, are legitimate, concerns, questions that we want to make sure of. And I do think capturing the good and addressing the bad is the important piece. But I think that this is an area we're going to continue to see expand. I know as I'm scrolling Instagram, somehow the algorithm is figured out. Maybe I'm suffering from burnout sometimes, right? And it's promoting all these apps to me that are out there. And so beyond just what we're using in the K-12 world, we know that mental health providers and others are using lots of different apps and platforms to put supports out there for folks. And so I think this can be a really good thing, but I want to make sure that as we're capturing and as we're using that, again, that we're balancing the good and the bad. As I say that, the thunder rolls behind me as we think about that. But I think that's another area. I see some folks here, have note some of the programs you guys are using. If anybody has programs you recommend, certainly share with one another here. for that. But I do think that as we are, I think we'll just see that continue to expand to meet needs as we see students have more and more social emotional needs. And as we have shortages of folks in that realm, to try and fill the gap that needs to be there using some of those platforms. So thoughts, questions, anything else on that front before we really shift gears here into some other topics? Again, I see some great resources here people have noted. And if you guys have questions, feel free to pop them in. But as we talk about the trends in EdTech right now, one of those, and not in a good way right now, is money. In recent years, I think schools have had a lot of short-term resources, ESSER money, COVID money, all the stuff that was coming up. I think that districts were really spent a lot over the last 5 years to invest in technology and platforms and devices and rolling that out to students. But I think we're about to see the horizon shift on us in terms of really having a funding cliff that we've really been relying on for a lot of our technology. We know that the fate of E-rate is going to be decided by the Supreme Court. There is a case in front of the Supreme Court this term that is challenging the constitutionality of E-rate, and it is possible the Supreme Court could strike that down and that could go away, which is a significant source of funding for many, many of us listening today. Now, I don't think that's going to happen based upon listening to the oral argument, but you never know till it's decided, and we'll wait and see what the Supreme Court says when that decision is released here in the coming weeks or months. So, E-rate is potentially out there of concern. We know that ESSER and other sort of pandemic era funding sources are ending. And so those short-term resources we had to spend money to invest in our tech infrastructure and our devices aren't going to be there necessarily in the future. And that is going to be an issue that's there for us. We know that most experts right now are predicting an economic downturn or recession, which may impact school revenues across the board. And so as school districts are looking to tighten their belts across the board over the next year or so, obviously that's going to impact, are we going to have the money to spend on things like technology? Do we view that as a priority, or do we view that as an extra? And I don't think every district has the same priorities about that. And so I think that's a piece that's going to be out there. And then, of course, tariffs are making the cost of a lot of EdTech higher. And will continue to do so if they remain in place. So that's also going to reduce the purchase power of school districts, based on those tariffs that are out there for us. So I do think that we need to be ready for the reality that new purchases and major purchases in the area of EdTech may be more limited in coming years. And so making sure that we can maintain our existing technology resources are going to also come at a cost. So I think we've got to be planning for that maintenance and budgeting carefully, because I do think that in this world of EdTech, money is going to be an area that we're going to be of concern about. And so I don't think as we sit here today, we can have a good conversation about this without a conversation about money and how we're planning for that. So thoughts, questions, comments on the financial piece to that. I know that that's not happy news, right, for us, but I do think it's worth having on our radar as we head into next school year.
I just wanted to jump in here too, Brandon, and say that here at the LTC, we're also aware that this is going to be an issue coming up in the future potentially. And so if you want to stay kind of up to date on tech and connectivity funding, I left a link in the chat. We do have our Director of Government Affairs and Purchasing for the LTC, Mindy Fiscus. She's super on top of things. So you can find her information at that link as well if you want to reach out or discuss anything with E-rate or funding or connectivity. It's just one more resource for people as we move forward into what could be not some fun times, like you said. So yes, if you have questions, though, leave them in the chat. I just wanted to pop on and kind of give a little resource there too.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's great. And I know the LTC does so many provides so many great, resources and information for everybody. So I think that's fantastic as we think about it. Well, let's dig in, as we're almost halfway through our hour this afternoon. These last two issues are the ones that we'll spend the bulk of our time on as we think it through. But we do want to think about cybersecurity issues and some of the key trends I'm seeing. I want to give you some reminders, but then also look at a couple key trends. And then we really want to dig into AI, the changes in press policy on AI, and what you need to know to be thinking about in that regard for us. So, again, we all know, right? Everybody who's participating today, cybersecurity is such an important part of our jobs, such an important part of what school districts are doing. And especially as we think about the emergence of AI, that makes data privacy and cybersecurity even a more essential and important consideration, to keep in mind for us. And we continue to see cybersecurity threats against school districts continuing to grow. So we want to make sure that we are focusing on putting those safeguards in place, having the right program, looking for those foreseeable risks, training employees in meaningful ways. That might be the most important piece to this, right? To make sure that, think about who is your weakest link in terms of being susceptible to a phishing scam or malware or downloading something they shouldn't. Those are things we've got to keep in mind. Making sure our third parties, our operators, our vendors are doing that, and not just set it and forget it, but continuing to reassess that program over time to really look for that, putting the right technical systems in place for us, for data storage, for detecting and responding to system failures, to data breaches, to those attacks that are there for us. Those are things that are really important. And so we've got to keep those goals of SOPA in mind, right? Where we've got the right policy, we've got written agreements with operators, we're posting those on the website, and we're implementing those reasonable security measures. And I want to make sure we're all aware the LTC updated those reasonable security practices in December, right? So in the past, we talked about 43 reasonable security practices. Now we've got 48, right? And those have certainly shifted and edited. And so it's important to take a step back and make sure you're looking at those updated, security practices, and that some of those really are focusing on the training piece. And so I've, obviously not listing all 48 of those here, and you all have those available from the LTC, but I think the training part of that is, and Linda's put the link to those in the chat for everybody. But please make sure that you understand the training component of those reasonable security practices is really an essential part of what's going on. And that part of that is communicating with all employees that they cannot use online sites or services or apps that are not pre-approved for use by the district, with which we don't have an operator agreement that is approved and posted on our website. All those things that SOPA requires of us. This was not a one-time thing where we got compliant. It's ongoing compliance is really important. And again, LTC is Student Privacy Alliance makes that really easy for you to do that. So I think part of that is, again, communicating with employees, training them to make sure they can only use those approved operators, implement those reasonable security practices, especially when they're using district devices or accessing the district's network away from school. That's really important for us, and keep that policy in place and updated. We're going to talk about the policy changes here, specifically related to AI in a little bit, but I do want to make sure that we understand that the existing press policy says we're going to have an EdTech committee who's going to take ownership of these privacy and cybersecurity issues. That's going to designate who can enter into those agreements with operators, and list who that is going to be. And so the role of that EdTech committee has been there, and it's important. As we'll see in a little bit, press has also given the EdTech committee in each district some additional jobs as it relates to AI. But we know that they play a really important role for that. The other area where I think I am seeing more legal issues pop up and that's employees storing documents on private cloud storage, when we've got employees who have a Dropbox or Google folder or some other type of cloud storage that is not approved for use by the district, not affiliated with their school account, right? Like having a saving things in a Google folder that's affiliated with their personal Gmail account or whatever. And I think we just need to be very clear with those parameters. I think that is an area where I'm seeing more and more concern, more and more practices that I think violate FERPA and the Student Records Act and SOPA, as well as our other cybersecurity pieces, and is not consistent with our reasonable security practices. And so I want us to make sure that we are having clear communication, clear expectations, good training for our employees about cloud storage and what is and is not an approved place for them to store documents, especially documents that might relate to student matters and student issues. We do have a case out of Missouri a couple years ago where the Supreme Court of Missouri upheld the dismissal of a tenured teacher for saving student files, including student IEPs and evaluations, in her personal Google folder. So again, we want to make sure that we are not violating FERPA or the Student Records Act related to that. So I think those are pieces that we want to keep in mind. We want to be very, very mindful of in that regard. So thoughts, questions, feelings on the data privacy, document storage, cybersecurity piece to that. I think those are just trying to find those practical ways. Where are those things that are our weakest link? And right now, one of those, what I am certainly seeing, are employees' choices for cloud storage in a way that may not be compliant. It may be convenient, but it's not legally compliant. And while you look at that, I'm going to look at the radar because I hear the sirens going off, and I'm going to make sure that it's really looks like it's well north of me. All right, so I'm going to keep talking despite the fact that we've got the sirens going off for us here. So those of you, I see some of you who are in Central Illinois and are in the path here when you checked in. So hopefully everybody's staying safe and things. But let's move into our last segment here, which is our biggest conversation today. And that is really thinking about AI and where are our next steps with AI. I think that as the initial hype around AI starts to fade, I think it's time for us to really start to focus on the nuts and bolts of how we make AI work for schools. And that we see advancements coming in AI and virtual reality, in more personalized and digital learning. These are going to become more standard. We're going to have to get down to the nuts and bolts of that. We already see lots of platforms that are allowing educators to do that. Forbes reported recently that 60% of educators are already using some form of AI in their classrooms on a daily basis. And that number is only going to increase as we continue to see that being something we've got to keep in mind. And so we see content creation. This has been, significant. We see some of these sort of generative AI creating, some high quality materials, lessons plans, resources, quizzes. I see folks using AI to generate IEPs, generate behavior intervention plans, to suggest accommodations, to synthesize a student's evaluation and come up with recommendations for students with IEPs. So, these can be really powerful. And so I think the key for us, right, is focusing on those nuts and bolts to make sure that we are harnessing the good that comes from that. So how do we do that? I think the first place we have to realize is we've got to start pedagogy first, right? Before AI can be of any use to teachers, they've got to be trained how to use it. And so it can't just be something that we have them and say, good luck. It's got to be something where there is intentionality behind it. There's training behind it. The purpose is understood for us. And that students also have to learn to view the output of AI with a critical eye and interact it with ethical ways. So we think about plagiarism. We think about, what is there. We got to get past, I saw a story recently where they talked about, there's an entire college course where students are using AI to write their papers, the professor using AI to grade the papers, and nobody's ever actually looking at this. And it's just sort of all fake pedagogy. And we've got to be able to find the ethical ways to use it for what is good. And I think there's some challenges to that, right? The digital divide is there. Not everybody having access to the infrastructure and the platforms and having the resources to do that. Second is certainly the training and adaptability of educators. So how we really integrate those technologies into the classroom, into learning spaces, that's going to require not just a one-time drop, but ongoing professional development, ongoing coaching for teachers to be able to use those tools effectively in their practice of teaching. And then we've got to think about that ethical piece to it, right? We've got concerns about bias and transparency, copyright issues, plagiarism issues that exist for us as well. And these are going to be things that are going to be at the front burner of some of these things, especially the copyright piece to this. We see more and more lawsuits where some of these, large language models are capturing copyrighted materials and copyrighted works as part of what their generative AI piece. And that's of concern for us to think about. We also, within the past few weeks, just about a month ago, the president did issue an executive order on AI and education. Mostly that the executive order just directs various administrative agencies like the Department of Ed to take certain steps. But I think there are a couple notes from that executive order that stands out as sort of, part of the policy of the Department of Ed at this time. That by fostering AI competency, we want to equip students with the foundational knowledge and skills necessary to adapt and thrive in an increasingly digital society, that it needs to be part of teaching and learning, and that it is the policy of the United States to promote AI literacy and proficiency among Americans by promoting the appropriate integration of AI into education, providing comprehensive AI training for educators, and fostering early exposure to AI concepts and technology to develop an AI-ready workforce in the next generation of American AI innovators. So we really see this push, this focus that's there. There's in the currently pending proposed budget bill in Congress would prohibit states from regulating AI, leaving that within the federal domain and other things. So I think we're going to definitely see continued massaging of that at the federal level. At the local level, I think this is where we need to start thinking about those policy directives. And so in the April 2025 press updates, right, that just came out here about a month ago, and I suspect many, if not all of your districts use press for your policies and procedures. For the first time, the IASB, the Illinois Association of School Boards, that does press, issued a number of policy updates that specifically make changes and add language related to AI. For example, the EdTech committee is now tasked with creating an AI plan for the district. And so that committee work has been added. The acceptable use policy and procedure was also updated to specifically address some of the concerns related to AI. And so I think it's really important for each of your districts to be making good decisions, taking a look at those policies. And I recommend them. I think they're good policies. I think the policy language is good, but I want to make sure we're not just adopting them without thinking about them. And from that legal perspective, right, I want to make sure that we're taking to heart what we are saying as a matter of policy, so that it matches what our goals and our practices are as a district. And to that end, I want to recognize that there was a specifically new procedure developed, 6235 AP3, which specifically is an AI procedure that sets forth the procedures for developing an AI plan for each school district and some of those responsible use of AI guidelines. So within that procedure, I think there's a couple things that stand out to me. First of all, it relies on the Department of Ed's AI toolkit that was issued last October. And if you hung out with me this winter, we talked about that. I did print out a copy, thank goodness, and IASB has it available because it's no longer available from the Department of Ed. The Department of Ed has taken down the toolkit, but I find the toolkit still to be a really helpful resource. And Apparently, so did IASB and the folks who write the press policies, because they actually incorporated it and are attaching it within that, so that you should have access to that. And so I do think that relying on that toolkit is really important. As I mentioned, that procedure says the EdTech committee is going to create and review regularly the district's AI plan. And so within that procedure, there are some specific responsibilities there for them to set some goals for the district related to AI, to look at what is going to be used, to set forth what is going to be considered responsible use, and how the district will address that. So I do think it is important that, again, we're not just adopting that procedure and sticking it in a folder someplace, but actually taking a look at it and saying, what is it that we're expected to do, so we can follow through, because it's got lots of implications. It's got implications for, obviously, data privacy and cybersecurity issues. It's got implications for teaching and learning and our curriculum choice. It's got implications for student discipline as it relates to, again, plagiarism, deep fakes, the responsible and ethical use of AI, looking at bias within the algorithm that might exist. So those things are there for us. That procedure also sets forth some of those SOPA data privacy requirements. And then it also sets forth expectations about professional development to staff related to AI. So I think it is particularly important that we're keeping all of those pieces in mind when it comes to AI and what that procedure is there. And so, not to give you homework, but to give you some homework, I think one of the important things that we want to be able to do here is to take a look at what, those new policies and procedures expect of us, and that we're following through in order to meet those expectations. Because I think that as we see, again, AI becoming more and more a part of what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, again, it's finding that way to balance the good and bad, and harnessing the good and creating procedures that are going to help us overcome the risks and the concerns that exist. And so I think that is, again, particularly important to recognize. That's a change to come to us from that perspective. So now is the chance to come back and we can think through some of these issues, think through some of these questions that are going on out there. We've got lots of time left here to be able to think through some of these issues if folks have questions to think about. But, this is an area of the law that's continuing to expand, continuing to grow. And so as we think about those implications for EdTech, I think those are some of the front burner things I've seen occurring. So what's out there on your plate that you guys want to ask about or think about in the rest of our time this afternoon?
Yes, please go ahead and leave any questions that you have in the chat here. And while we're waiting for some to filter in, I promise that Brandon and I did not get together before this and talk about ways to plug stuff at the LTC. But I did want to also mention, I left a resource in the chat for our online courses. That's courses.ltcillinois.org. And we have a ton of new AI courses coming out. And we have some that we just released, including one about getting on top of AI and plagiarism, how to utilize like Google Gemini for teachers, for students, just some basic AI 101, like you're new to AI. So please feel free to send your staff there to register. It's all free. If you yourself want training on it, we're here to support you as we talk about, pedagogy, best practices, how to utilize AI moving forward. These are just some free, easy resources for you guys to train your staff and get some training yourself if you want. We do have one question in the chat, or a couple here. So first is, back in the day, there were very clear guidelines on copyright. What are those nowadays?
Well, the good news is they haven't really changed, right? So those expectations about what is considered fair use and educational use, those guidelines that exist haven't changed, right? So our ability to have limited fair use without violating copyright is still there, especially in the educational environment. But certainly things that go outside of those guidelines are still violations of copyright. Where we see that sort of taking AI aside for a second, I'm going to come back to AI. Where we've seen that pop up for districts sometimes are, for example, showing a copyrighted work like a movie in class, right? That you can do that within the instructional framework, within fair use. But then when we're using it for like a PTO night where we're doing it as a fundraiser, that's a violation, you know? And so, you know, you've got good expectations in your policy that set forth those specific rules of fair use. So the rules haven't really changed. But what has certainly changed is AI has come in like a bulldozer and is sucking in all of these copyrighted works as part of its creation of generative AI, or sometimes is. And so we certainly see litigation, lawsuits, concerns out there about when and how some of those LLMs are bringing, bringing copyrighted work into the generative system and creating works that are based upon copyrighted works. And that's a real concern. You know, that's one of the things that's sort of on that threshold of AI, not just in education, but writ large. That ultimately I think is going to have to be regulated by statute or by the courts to make sure that the rights of those who hold the copyright are not being violated because AI has become too powerful and doesn't know where to stop at the boundary of what might be copyrighted. But I think for us in schools, those guidelines about copyright and fair use are the same rules as they've always been.
Yeah, and you'll have to forgive me if I'm misspeaking here, Brandon, and correct me if I am. But I think some of what questions I've been getting about copyright too is like, is the AI itself, like the responses that the AI is giving you, are those in and of themselves copyrighted? And do we need to cite those, or do we need to say like this was created by AI as like a citation on things that are being generated?
Yeah, the case law on that is mixed at this point. There are certainly cases that suggest that if it's not created by a human being, then it may not be subject to copyright. But then there are cases that suggest there might be times where that isn't true. So that is an area of the law that is emerging and is shifting. And again, we're still sort of at the front end of figuring out how courts are going to deal with some of those issues.
Well, thanks for the insight on that. We do have another question here. Emily asked, what are some of the updates to 2150 for the EdTech committees? Or is that the EdTech committee being involved with the AI plan?
So it's really that latter piece. It doesn't create a new committee. It basically says the existing EdTech committee is going to be the entity that is ultimately responsible for the RTI plan. And so, it doesn't necessarily create a new committee. It relies on that EdTech committee that Press already had existing, but it does give them some specific responsibilities. And those include identifying the specific goals regarding AI. So there will be district goals related to AI. It will create an AI plan. It has to create an AI responsible use guidelines. And it also has to set forth the plan for professional development and communication with stakeholders. So those are that's sort of the short version of the tasks that the EdTech committee has now. If you adopt that press policy and procedure as it is, it's not a new committee. It's taking the EdTech committee and also giving them responsibility for AI. And those are the responsibilities that procedure sets forth for the EdTech committee.
Thank you for being here. And again, Brandon, thank you as always for being so generous with your time, for being here with us, and for keeping us kind of abreast of some of these issues that are happening across the board with the law.
Well, thanks for hanging out, and thanks for letting me hang out. Always happy to join.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and say sayonara to everyone. And again, stay safe with the storms coming through, and we hope to see you very soon.